In London, a city of history, politics and culture, a fundamental human right is being tested: the right to protest. Protesting, used as a tool for change for centuries, stands as a cornerstone of democracy, but in recent times that right has faced challenges, debates and controversy. Protesters and activists are now forced to follow a thin line of legislation, leaving them restricted by new laws, and as tensions rise, questions have begun to emerge.
Successful protest in your eyes?
I think so. What it's succeeded in doing is showing just how intolerant the government are now of any kind of peaceful protest.
There's not very much else I can do. I've written to my MP and I've petitioned and stuff like that, and there's nothing else I can do really other than to protest.
Is the government taking our right to protest away, or is it being corrected?
It's the Guardian reading, tofu eating, wokerati, dare I say, the anti-growth coalition that we have to thank for the disruption that we are seeing on our roads today.
Join me as I navigate through this charged landscape, meet the people at the forefront and delve into the heart of a debate that defines democracy. Nestled amongst the busy streets of London's financial district, Extinction Rebellion activists meet at their rendezvous point. In the corner of a coffee shop, they prepare to spend the day peacefully protesting in the precincts of a leading insurance firm. Armed with handouts detailing their cause, members of the team will look to raise awareness. I had been invited to attend as an embedded journalist by Mary Smale, a frequent protester. We spoke about the day ahead.
How am I feeling about today? I'm hoping that we can do the action and that we haven't been preempted too much by the police and the security. Some kind of action will happen. It might not be the one that we planned. But if we don't speak out in what we see as an imminent danger to society, how can we sit at home and not do that? If you act within your integrity, then you have the courage to do whatever is necessary to do what we need to achieve.
Soon the group set off. Separating into pairs, they arrived at different times. Tagging along at the end, I was led to the target location. The police were already waiting for their arrival, despite the secrecy of the event. But unfazed, the activists exercised their right to protest. As planned, a group went into the lobby to demonstrate, whilst others stood outside holding banners and handing out leaflets. How do you feel when people just walk past?
Well, we know. We know that many people don't want to know. They're too heads down, concerned with what they're doing at this particular moment. Many people are just not open to engagement. But some are, as you can see. Some people actually ask for a leaflet. But the ones working in there, it's very much head down, go straight in, not interested. I suspect they probably feel a bit intimidated by our presence, I don't know.
An activist liaison officer ensures that there is full communication between the police and the activists, and with new government legislation now targeting peaceful protest, it is their job to keep up to date with the changing landscape.
The really sad thing about it is that the government has decided to make this a political football. This is something that should unify all of us. It should unify everyone across political parties, regardless of what they think is the solution. We need every solution. And the government has decided to create a wedge for their own political gain. And I think that's so immoral. It is just utterly outrageous that they would think this is a subject on which they should do that. And the laws that they're passing against protest are a reflection of that.
Although activists can still demonstrate and protest, their right and ability to do so is quickly crumbling, as new laws have begun to weaken the right to peacefully protest, forcing old laws out. In 1986, a pivotal moment emerged with the inception of the Public Order Act. Its objective to establish a framework for regulating public assemblies while curbing disorderly conduct. This landmark legislation aimed to empower law enforcement to manage issues ranging from racial hatred to unlawful assembly, including the spectres of riots and highly volatile protests. Fast forward 12 years and a seismic shift occurred with the Human Rights Act of 1998. Incorporating the European Convention on Human Rights, this legislative milestone provided individuals with tangible, enforceable rights. From the right to a fair trial to the principles of liberty and the right to life, it ushered in a new era of civil liberties. For 2 decades, the tapestry of protest laws remained largely unaltered until April 2022. Enter Suella Braverman and the controversial Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, a legislative juggernaut initially branded as draconian and anti-democratic by the House of Lords. Then just 11 months later, another chapter unfolded with the arrival of the new Public Order Act of 2023. This latest iteration of legislation cast a long shadow, criminalising specific forms of peaceful dissent, moving in an era of serious disruption prevention orders and a lowered threshold for disruption. Together, these legislative milestones paint a compelling portrait of the UK's evolving landscape of protest rights, where each new law serves as a brushstroke, drastically reshaping the canvas of civil liberties and public dissent. The new legislation has left the current right to protest in a delicate state, as human rights lawyers now state that the police have unlimited powers when it comes to arresting at protests. Despite this though, protests and demonstrations continue. Later in the day, I went to an Extinction Rebellion march. It aimed to raise further awareness about climate change to insurance workers, as big insurance firms continue to work on major fossil fuel contracts. The march started from a parish church in Aldgate, London, with stewards and police guiding the protest. Hundreds of XR members began their trip through the busy streets of the financial district, their drums reverberating between the skyscrapers and hubs of financial services. With roads blocked, this protest, despite causing more than a minor disruption, went ahead with no arrests or any action from the police, presumably because the event was entirely pre-planned. But to understand how and why the right to protest like this is so important, I went to the London School of Economics, where I interviewed Dr. Miriam Tresh, an expert in social activism and protests.
Meaningful change requires this tipping point, right, from a silent majority, right, a silent majority to get behind some cause, again, be that a precise change or kind of a broader change in structures, but a silent majority tipping over, and even people who are not maybe directly impacted by that. Social movements within democracy, for example, have various avenues that people can explore, right? There are those kind of more institutional, conventional ways, right? You can strategically vote, you lobby, you can do all of these sorts of things. As the system starts to change, or if people start to feel marginalised, you'll see variations in those methods, right? So more risky behaviours happening if people aren't being listened to or are feeling marginalised.
In November, I went to an organised protest by Just Stop Oil. It was one of many across a whole month. The first thing I noticed was that the police clearly outnumbered the amount of activists. Tensions were high.
And so we need to do something. And I'm a nursery school teaching assistant. There's not very much else I can do. I've written to my MP and I've petitioned and stuff like that, and there's nothing else I can do really other than to protest and to demonstrate by marching in the road.
Within seconds of stepping onto the road, the police took matters into their own hands. The activists were arrested for violating Section 7 of the new Public Order Act, which meant that they were interfering with the use of major infrastructure. I spoke to a protest liaison officer to get an idea of what his role was and why the police reacted the way they did.
I liaise with the protesters to facilitate what they're doing.
Oh, wow, really?
So they'll come to us and we want to go march here, we want to do this, we want to do that.
Yeah.
We will let people know. We'll pass. So police demonstrations is like a very big game of chess, isn't it? That way, so. But yeah, basically we're just a normal cop. I normally work on a response team, but this is just a secondary skill as a liaison officer. It just sort of like slightly different to the yellow high vis. But yeah, other than that, well,
You've been doing this all week?
this is my first day this week and I'm doing it Friday as well. But I am here a lot of the time on it. So, yeah.
I was going to say there's a lot more police officers than protesters.
Well, there's also the state visit from South Korea as well, isn't there? So we're covering that.
Can I see the map?
Amongst the other day-to-day policing of central London. So there's always things going on in London that people might not necessarily see. Visits from other countries, parliaments and so on and so forth. There's also the change in the guide. There's a lot going on that you don't always see, hence why there's so many old built police in London.
It was now clear to me that the implementation of these new statutory powers meant that the right to protest has now consequently fallen under state control. But what does this mean for activists?
The problem, and I think this has always been the problem of protesting, is that it's not as much a matter of the law, but how, say, the police interpret it on the ground. If they're confronting, 1,000 of you, 2,000 of you down the high street on a Saturday afternoon, there's the disparity in power that you have between, say, police officers and you generally don't know the law and you assume that they do. So if they tell you not to do something, likelihood is that you're going to obey it, even if they've got it wrong or don't understand it, or a court case later decides it wasn't a lawful thing for them to ask you to stop, to take your banners down or whatever. By then it's too late. So there's I suppose the way I would look at it is there are legal problems that you face as a protester. So there are legal hurdles that you have to go through. There are policing powers that are separate, sort of related to that, but actually open up a much greater swathe of potential interference. I mean, what human rights lawyers would call chilling effect. So it's not always, the law that's the problem. It is sometimes how it's interpreted by the people that operate that law, say here by the police, or by people's understanding of what they can do and can't do.
Between October 1st, 2022 and 14th of December 2022, the Metropolitan Police made 750 arrests at Just Stop Oil protests. This alone cost the taxpayer over £7.5 million, with some 13,600 Metropolitan Police officer shifts required to manage the arrests. In October 2022, HS2 Limited estimated that sustained protester activity at some sites had cost the project up to £146 million. Back in 2019, between April and October, protests caused standstills in London's busiest areas for several days. The impact of this cost the police an approximate £37 million. This paved way for the new legislation in 2021. This new approach from government started in 2021, a year where we saw a huge increase in the amount of peaceful, disruptive protests, but more importantly, protests that captured the attention and interest of the nation's media and public. To paint a better picture of the build-up to the crackdown on the right to protest, I went to see Biff Whipster. Biff was involved in heavily disruptive peaceful protests back in December 2021, reaching the front pages of national newspapers. He took part in the Insulate Britain protests that blocked the M25.
So what did it feel like? We thought we'd be there for 10 minutes. We were there 90 minutes before the police turned up. So it did take the state by surprise, let's put it that way. And the congestion was quite heavy, but I didn't feel threatened at any time. We'd rehearsed, we had gone through quite a lot of training beforehand where we'd simulated beating each other up, verbal abuse and physical abuse. We'd gone through non-violence training by some Buddhists, all these sort of things. It's quite interesting. and we'd agreed what would happen if the person next to you gets the proverbials kicked out of them. Would we intervene non-violently? Would we not? Would we allow that to happen? There were lots of discussions and lots of pre-planning via Zoom, for example, about what happened with Gandhi and the Salt March and for Indian independence. And basically, it did take peaceful protesters getting beaten up to shift public awareness.
In 2021, Biff was arrested 17 times in 2 months for peaceful protesting. He received a civil injunction, meaning that he could be arrested if he was seen at another protest. Yet he and others went beyond the civil threats.
And then part of the strategy as well was taking the challenge and change to the judiciary. So that was part of Enslaved Britain's experiment, knowing that future things such as Just Stop Oil would be coming along in the future and all these sort of things. And so the fascinating thing that's been happening in the courts, I don't know how well that's been publicised and reported on, but with people that are just challenging the juries to make a decision based on conscience and not on direction by the judges. So as you may know, the first people that were jailed for Enslaved Britain were in breach of a civil injunction, so no criminal case, it was just civil. 9 people went to prison for that. I should have been the 10th, but my arresting officer happened to go sick on the day he was supposed to sign some bits of paper up, so I escaped jail. I then was in the next tranche of people for breaching the High Court injunction, because I was one of the ones that, when the injunctions came out, and we were told you lose your house, you lose your assets, you'll be 2 years in prison, I went out on the M25, again, in the full knowledge of that. We'll bring it on, embrace it. You get swept along with these things.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country is at war.
His government says the Palestinian militant group Hamas launched more than 2,000 rockets into the country.
Israel retaliated with waves of airstrikes. Tonight, hundreds from both sides are dead or injured.
We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself.
In decades, Palestinian fighters have breached.
The equivalent of the crowd of 10 cup finals came to London on Saturday to march for peace in Gaza because they're appalled at what's happening.
But
specifically about
I
Hamas
agree
terrorists.
with him. I agree with him. The thing is, the question is, what is a proportionate response? Because it has been different from one tier to another. So if you look to this graph, for example, this is the death of Israeli and Palestinians, and it's changing from 1 year to year. It's like fluctuating like crypto. So my question is today, what is the going rate today for human life?
It was April the 27th, and I was on my way to my first pro-Palestine protest. For 7 months, a devastating conflict between Israel and Hamas had dominated the news headlines. I went with a Palestine solidarity group from Medway. A network of protesters met at the House of Parliament as part of a very well organised demonstration, forming by far the biggest protest I'd been to. With thousands surrounding the Houses of Parliament, all in the name of Palestinian solidarity, the police were ready to assist and supervise in their hundreds. Palestine protests have become a regular fixture for City and London police, as the new acts mean that the police have full discretion, making protests a more pressing matter to the police force. I spoke to Jack Jones, a PhD student at UEA. His research analyses the new legislation's impact on police forces.
And from my perspective, from what I've seen of it all, my view on that is that at the situation that it has become now, that it didn't used to be in the past, but it now has become, is that we have the right to protest at the discretion of the police. And essentially, it is up to the police whether or not they allow us to do it, because their powers are now so wide-ranging. Anything more, like anything more than minimal that impacts more than 2 people can have a condition imposed upon it to say, don't do that. Now, the police don't have to use that power, but they can. And so if you're a protest group that doesn't play by the rules, then the police are going to view you as more illegitimate than those who do. So, for example, the Palestine Solidarity protests, they communicate with the police beforehand, and they communicate with them in advance, and they agree. The police say, okay, we won't use these excessive powers against you, but you have to start here, you have to finish here, you have to start at this time, you have to finish at that time, you're not allowed to deviate from this route. They agree to it, and therefore everyone's playing by the rules of the game. And essentially, the protesters are getting permission from the police to do it, even though in law, they don't need permission from the police to do it. That notion doesn't exist in the UK. We don't need to get permission from the state or from the police to protest. And yet we're now in a position where effectively we do, because if you don't get advance permission, like Just Stop Oil, you just turn up and you go into the road, you're going to get arrested.
As far as I could see, Palestinian protesters filled the streets. The police this time did not bother with arrests. Instead, they separated a sea of protesters. It's the 27th of April 2024, and as you can see, I'm at a Palestine protest. Now, this has been like this for miles on end, and it seems that there are no arrests. The police are actually helping the protesters, guide them and steer them to their locations. The Palestine marches concluded at Hyde Park. As thousands gathered to hear speeches, I reflected on my journey. Instead of acting for the people by listening to the views and messages of the public, activists are met with neglectful legislation that takes away from their civil rights, and it looks like it's set to continue with their new criminal justice bill in the works.
There are certain criminal offences that have a reasonable excuse attached to them. So, like a willful obstruction on the highway is one of them. If you obstruct the highway, there's a defence to it of reasonable excuse. And the courts have interpreted that to mean you can rely upon your right to freedom of expression and to freedom of assembly, essentially the right to protest, as a defence to a charge of willful obstruction on the highway. And there are a few other offences with that attached to it, including in the new Public Order Act that went through Parliament just last year in 2023. All of the new sort of protest offences have a reasonable excuse. So therefore, they have to be justified and proportionate to the right of the protester to protest. And the criminal justice bill is essentially going to strip all of that out.
I've been left questioning the new laws surrounding the right to protest. Should it really be a punishable criminal offence to protest for what you believe in?
Is that we just have to be more tolerant of people who want to make a political point.
Should it really be a punishable criminal offence to protest for what you believe in? From all the protests I had been to, I couldn't help but think that some were treated differently to others, and that the right to protest does not operate as a fixed law, rather one that varies on circumstances. But how would you like your right to protest?